Oh, just imagine how much nicer the living room's going to look with the shelf up in it.
Well, for safe and successful construction of this shelf, we are going to need 2 adults, a medium-sized Phillips head screwdriver, a spirit level, and a claw or ball pin hammer. I shall go ahead and count the fixings as per the instructions. 1, 2.
We're going to be missing something. We're always missing something. Oh, and while we're talking about it, I am not standing here holding this while you use that hammer. My thumb has only just stopped hurting from the last time.
The Household Magazine's Home Improvements says that in the UK there is only a 50% chance of hand injury while using a hammer.
Well, there you go. The numbers are in our favour.
I'm filled with such confidence. I'm still not holding it while you use that hammer.
Well, just hang on to it for a second, will you? Because I need to...
I can't believe you just dropped that on my foot.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
I knew those statistics were wrong.
Well, I think you'll find those statistics were for injury to the hand while using a hammer. If you give me a moment, I can tell you what the statistics are for injury to the other part of the body.
Can I suggest this is a great time for a tea break?
Ooh.
Very sorry about your toe. I don't know if you have ever had a moment where you have realized that something in your future might hang in the balance of a decision you're about to make or an action you're about to take. One of my family's favorite movies growing up was this movie, Back to the Future. Any fans in the room? Any fans online? We'd love to know. So if you aren't familiar with the movie Back to the Future, it centers on this feeling of the future hanging in the balance of decisions we make and actions we take. And the premise of Back to the Future 1 is our main character, Marty, has found himself back in time, trying to get back to the future where he came from, at a time where his parents are in school together but haven't yet met and begun to date. And Marty realizes that he needs to get his dad to pluck up the courage to ask Lorraine, the girl he fancies but hasn't had the courage to ask to the school dance, out, because Lorraine and George would eventually become Marty's parents. Marty realizes that his own future hangs in the balance. His very existence hangs in the balance of whether he can get his dad to pluck up the courage to ask Lorraine to the dance. And this movie was a massive hit at the time. It continues to be kind of a cultural phenomenon, doesn't it? Still today, we look back at this movie, we celebrate it, it's like something about it captivated us. And I wonder, I think there's loads of reasons for that, but I wonder if one of the reasons is that we find this idea that the future hangs in the balance of our decisions and our actions, that there are versions of the future that we're always stepping towards, and that the things we do today affect the future we will one day have, and maybe even the future our children and our children's children will one day have. We find that so compelling, that something significant might hang in the balance of the decisions that we make day by day. And I don't know if you've ever had a moment where you actually start to feel a bit daunted by the realization that an action you're about to take or a decision that you are about to make might have kind of ginormous consequences for your future, that they're actually really consequential for where your life will head. Maybe that's the case right now for you. Maybe you are considering taking an action or making a decision that will have significant impacts on your future, and you are deciding, is that the future that I want? If any of you have ever proposed to somebody or accepted a proposal, you understand that daunting feeling of knowing that you are about to step into a certain version of the future, that what you do in that moment will have consequences for your future. And that can feel like a really daunting realization. If you've ever considered taking a job or leaving a job, if you've ever considered moving to another part of the country or even moving country, then you know what it feels like to feel daunted that the decision you may be about to make is going to have consequences for your future, that something hangs in the balance of the decision that you're about to make. And the reason that we hesitate when we make those decisions, and in fact, they're not just big decisions that affect big picture future, are they? They're moment by moment decisions that affect our immediate future. whether to talk to somebody, whether to ask a certain question in a meeting, whether to sit with somebody. These kind of decisions, whether to speak up, they're moment-by-moment decisions where we don't know what the outcome will be, and it feels like the future of the rest of the day, the rest of the week, maybe something even bigger, hangs in the balance. And if you're anything like me, when you feel that sense that something's hanging in the balance of what I'm about to do here, of what I could do here, you hesitate. There's something in you that hesitates, and I think there are a few reasons for that. The first reason is that we worry that it might create a problem for us in the future. That if we do that if we go there, that if we speak to them, that if we take this decision, take this job, marry this person, what if there's a problem further down the line that I haven't foreseen? The other thing I think we worry about is pain. What if eventually this decision or this action will cause me pain? We've all seen it, and we don't want it for ourselves. The other thing that I think we worry about is, well, what if it backfires? What if I say that and it comes back to bite me? What if I do that and it comes back to me and I'm kicking myself wishing I hadn't done that thing? And I think we get this question in our minds, what if I make the wrong decision? I remember at the time in my life where I was choosing what to study at university, this was the question that plagued me. I had this sense that maybe there was a wrong decision and a right decision, that there was a version of the future I was supposed to be going towards, but I didn't really know what it was. But I might miss out. I might make the wrong decision. It might end in disaster if I do. And I think this is a very human thing, whether you have faith or whether you don't have faith. This isn't a Christian thing. All of us hesitate when we realize that our decisions might have consequences for the future. When we realize that our future hangs in the balance, we worry. Am I going to make the right decision or the wrong one? Is this going to cause problems? Is it going to cause pain? And I want you to know, if you are somebody who is here today who wouldn't say that you have a faith or you're figuring out what you think about faith, you are so welcome. And in a very real sense, everything we do, we try to do with you in mind. And we want you to know that this is a place where you can explore that and think about that and challenge that. And I hope that today means something for you, even if you are not a person of faith at the moment. This is a really human question, isn't it? And in a world where best and worst case scenarios exist, and that's what we've called this series, best case scenario. The best case scenario is what we hope for, and the worst case scenario is what we fear, isn't it? And in a world where worst case scenarios exist, it takes a lot of courage to act without knowing the outcome, doesn't it? Because we've seen worst case scenarios played out in the lives of others, and we want to make sure they don't come our way. But we don't know what the future holds. So it takes courage to act in the face of a potential worst-case scenario. And that's the question that we're really going to dig into today is, when I feel daunted by the idea that the future may hang in the balance, how can I find the courage to act? How can I find the courage to act not knowing what the outcome will be, maybe even risking that the outcome may be one I didn't want or didn't plan for? And I'm going to introduce you to a story today. It may be one that's familiar to you, or it may be a brand new story to you, that I think holds this tension so well, of this idea of the future hanging in the balance and what it takes to act in the face of a future that hangs in the balance. And the story is found in a book called the Book of Esther. And it's actually a story that's in the Bible, but you wouldn't be surprised at all if you heard this story in a GCSE English class. It reads like a Shakespeare play, and you'll see what I mean by that a bit later on. And I just want you to know as well that if you are not a Christian, the Bible isn't a book for Christians, it's a book for people. And so I hope that you will be able to engage with the story and get something from this story wherever we're starting from today. But let me set the scene a little bit for this book, the Book of Esther. So it takes place in about 5th century BC, the events of the book. This is the Kingdom of Persia. And the Kingdom of Persia, their homeland was in an area that we would now know today as Israel, Palestine over here. And the events of this story take place in the city of Susa, which was the capital of the Kingdom of Persia. And at this point in time, the Jewish nation, even though they were designed to have their homeland here in what we would now call Israel, Palestine, they were spread throughout the Kingdom of Persia. And we're going to hang out today with a few people from this Jewish nation who were a minority people in the kingdom of Persia and who were in the capital city of Susa. So let me tell you this story. Let's paint the picture. So there's this king Xerxes. He's in charge of this whole empire, this whole kingdom. And King Xerxes is throwing a massive party, a multi-day, multi-month party, and he's invited all of the people who are going to make him look really good, and he's filling them with great food and great wine, and the point of the party is all about elevating his status and demonstrating what a great and powerful king he is, who stands over this entire kingdom. And during the course of this party, the king is a little bit intoxicated, and he summons his wife, Vashti, to appear in the party. Now, Vashti is incredibly beautiful, and the king wants basically to parade her around and say, look at the girl I've got, like, look how beautiful she is, and look what I've managed to win to have on my arm. So he demands that Vashti appears in this party and parades herself around. And Vashti's answer, as I'm sure the answer of many women in this room would be, is no. No, I don't want to be paraded around in front of your friends. And the king is absolutely enraged by this and mortified. And he gathers a group of people together, and he says, and they all were a group of men together, obviously. And they're all very concerned. How are we going to make sure that women don't think they can say no to their husbands in our kingdom? So what they decide to do is Vashti is denounced. She's dismissed as the queen. She's put aside, set aside, exiled out. And a letter is sent round to everybody telling them what has happened, that Vashti has been dismissed because she said no to her king. And all women in the kingdom must remember that you do not disobey your husbands. And this is where our hero of the story, Esther, comes in. One commentator on the book of Esther describes the hero, Esther, as a woman in a man's world and a Jew in a Persian's world. Everything is against her. She's a minority group in two aspects, and she's supposed to stay in her place as a woman in a man's world and a Jew in a Persian's world. At this point in the story, Esther is an orphan living just outside of the city of Susa. And she is a Jewish person, a minority group at this time. And the king decides now he's got rid of his first wife, he's going to have a beauty contest to get the fairest maiden in the land to be his next wife. So this beauty contest begins, and women from all over the kingdom, all types of backgrounds, nationalities are brought together to be part of this beauty contest. And Esther is one of these people, an orphaned Jewish girl. And all the other women in the contest have a lot more over her. They've got status, they've got fine clothes, they've got family connections. Esther is the least likely person to win this beauty contest, but she finds favor with the people who are running the beauty contest. And ultimately, she finds favor with the king. And the king chooses her to be his next queen. So Esther, this unlikely candidate for queen, becomes queen in this great kingdom. But she keeps her Jewish identity a secret because she's a minority group, because they're not favorably looked upon people at this time. She keeps her identity a secret, and that's going to be important for later. Now, there's two other characters that surface in the story at this moment. One is Esther's uncle, Uncle Mordecai, and the other is a guy called Haman, who is the king's right-hand man. Now, Mordecai stands outside the palace courts all the time so that he can communicate with Esther, so that he's there for Esther, but he can't actually go into the palace courts because he's not allowed. He doesn't have the status. And actually, it's not known that he is the uncle of Esther by other people. So Mordecai is standing out at the palace gates one day, and he overhears two guards, very disgruntled guards, plotting to kill the king, plotting to kill King Xerxes. And Mordecai sends word to Esther, and Esther alerts the king that there is this assassination attempt on his life. And this assassination attempt is averted because of this warning. Now, at the same time, Haman, the king's right-hand man, is strutting about the kingdom, asserting his authority and his power. And he goes past Mordecai, who is outside the palace courts. And Mordecai doesn't bow to him. Everybody else in the kingdom was obliged to show him deference because he was a really powerful person in the kingdom. He was the king's second. And Mordecai doesn't bow to Haman. He never bows to Haman. And this really gets under Haman's skin. And Haman discovers that this guy Mordecai, who won't bow to him, is a Jew. And so rather than just trying to deal with Haman, he begins to plot against the whole people of the Jews, the whole Jewish community. And he begins a plot to effectively carry out genocide against the Jewish people. It's a story that now kind of chills you because we live in the light of the events of the 20th century. But Haman begins this plot to get rid of all the Jewish people within the nation. And he approaches the king, and the king's the kind of guy who, if you flatter him and you say the right things, he'll sort of go with what you want if you stroke his ego. So Haman flatters the king, and he says, there's one group that aren't showing you the deference you deserve, and I think it'd be better if we just got rid of them. And Haman even offers to pay for the execution of the Jews. He says, I'll fund it if we can carry out this act of genocide. And so the king terribly agrees. And a word is sent out that on a certain day in March, the Jewish people will be exterminated. And of course, when the Jewish people hear of this, including Mordecai, they tear their clothes, they go into mourning, they begin to fast, they grieve with one another. They're a minority people, they don't have the power of the empire, and they know that there is a date set for their execution. And Mordecai sends word to Esther. Esther's inside of the palace. She's kind of cocooned from all of this. She doesn't know it's happening. Mordecai sends word to his niece, Esther, hoping that there might be a chance that she may be able to do something to avert this awful tragedy. Now, Esther sends back to Mordecai, basically reminding him that she doesn't have the position that he thinks she does. Yes, she's the queen, but she's not reigning with the king as king and queen like we might think of now. She's really only there for two reasons. She's there to sleep with the king and make him look good and do what he says. In fact, one of the reasons Esther was chosen in the beauty contest was because she seemed to be very compliant. The king was satisfied that she wouldn't do what Vashti did, that she'd go along with what the king wanted. So Esther reminds Mordecai, you know I can't stand up to the king. I don't have the authority. I don't have the power. And she also reminds Mordecai that anybody who goes into the king's chambers, that goes into the king's court without permission, without being invited, is executed. In fact, Esther would have seen this. She would have heard of people going into the king's chamber and coming out in pieces, And so she knows that there's a lot at stake if she was to do this. So she essentially writes to Mordecai and says, I can't do what you're asking me to do. I know the stakes, but I can't do it. And this is what Mordecai responds with. He says, do not think, Esther, that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. Now, I'll just pause there for a minute. Something that's really interesting about the book of Esther, and lots of people have lots of ideas about why this might be, is that the name for God, the word God, isn't mentioned in the whole book. It's the only book in the Bible where that's the case. And you might question then, well, why is it in the Bible? And that's because even though God's activity and God's name in the book is not explicit, it is always assumed. It's always assumed. And there are lots of ideas about why it might be that God's name isn't mentioned in this book, but I think it's as simple as, and this is my opinion, that God might be acting and God might be working in ways that we don't see, in ways that we don't understand, but it doesn't mean that he's not acting and he's not working, that it's still right for us to act even when we don't know exactly what God is doing in the midst of things. But Mordecai has faith that God will do something. He must do, because he says relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. He believes that the Jewish people have God on their side, that God will intervene in some way. It's like he's saying to Esther, Do you know what? This doesn't hang on you. The future doesn't hang on you. Some other deliverance will come from some other way. But it could hang on you. You could be part of the thing that God is going to do if you choose to act. Mordecai goes on, but you and your father's family will perish if you don't act. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. So Esther reflects on this. She knows that she will face a great cost if she risks going to the king, that she may be executed. She reflects on this, but it's almost like Mordecai has reminded of this truth. It doesn't depend on you, Esther. The outcome doesn't depend on you. God is going to do something, but it could depend on you. And maybe Esther couldn't get this out of her head. It doesn't depend on me. God will find another way. But it could. I could do something. I could avert this. And so she responds to Mordecai and she says, go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Again, this is how we know that God's presence is assumed, even if it isn't explicit in this story, because you don't fast unless there's somebody whose attention you're trying to get. You don't fast unless you're praying to somebody. And so she says, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and she has seen what happens to people who go against the law of the king. And if I perish, she says. Now, here's what happens next. Esther goes to the king, heart in her mouth probably, and she enters his court. And the king pardons her. He lets her off for disturbing his court. And Esther invites the king, rather than going straight in with her desire to avert this assassination attempt on the Jewish people, Esther invites the king to a banquet. And through the course of a few meals, she begins to sort of bring herself as more of an equal to the king. That she kind of flatters him with the things that he it responds to, like food and drink and stroking his ego. And she begins to elevate her position with the king and her standing with the king a little bit, so that when the time comes that she pleads for the life of her people, he might listen. So the king, Xerxes is the king, Haman, his second-hand man, and Esther go to these banquets together. Now, Haman goes home one evening after the second banquet, and he's bragging to his wife, oh, I've got a seat at the table with the king and queen of the land. I've made it. Esther's like, she's desperate for me to be involved in all of her banquets. And he's bragging to his wife, but he says, you know what, love? There's one thing that's still getting to me, this Mordecai. Haman's come past Mordecai again after the banquet, and Mordecai still will not bow to Haman. And so his wife says, okay, here's an idea. Why don't you erect a large spike in our front garden, and tomorrow evening you can impale Mordecai on it, so you can go to the banquet and sort of rest easy, because you know that Mordecai is going to be impaled, and he'll sort of be dealt with. So it's like a very weird sort of macabre situation being set up here. So Haman says, right, that's what I'll do. And he begins his plans to set up this giant spike to impale Mordecai on. At the same time, the king has a dream. The king dreams, and in his dream, he recollects, it's brought to mind that there was this assassination attempt on his life, and somebody alerted him. Somebody had let him know, and that had averted the assassination attempt. And he awakes, all panicked, thinking, I need to remember, who was it who saved my life? Who was it who averted that assassination attempt? And he calls people together, and he gets them to bring him a scroll that he writes down, like his journal almost, where he writes down everything that's happening in the kingdom. And this scroll is brought to him, and he reads that Mordecai was the person who alerted his people to the assassination attempt on his life. So the next morning, the king calls his guys into his court, and he calls Haman in, and he says, Haman, what should I do for a man who I want to honor above everybody else? And Haman thinks, here we go. I'm about to get the treatment I deserve. The king's going to honor me. So he says, oh, king, you should give him your clothes and give him your horse and parade him around and get other people to shout, oh, all hail, all hail. And so the king says, fantastic, go get Mordecai. I'd like that to be done for Mordecai. So Haman, the shame and the humiliation, has to parade Mordecai around the city with people shouting, all hail, all hail, all hail Mordecai, this guy who is Haman's nemesis. Meanwhile, he's got a spike in his front garden that he was hoping to impale Mordecai on that very day. We get to the final banquet, where Esther is finally going to reveal her plea that she wants the Jewish people to be saved. And so the king says to Esther, come on, you've kept asking us to these banquets. What is it that you want, Esther? Anything you ask, I will do it for you. And so Esther leans across the table and she says this to the king. If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. By the way, remember, her Jewish identity up until this point is still a secret. Grant me my life, this is my petition, and spare my people, this is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, this is a flattery piece, I would have kept quiet, of course, because there's no such distress would justify disturbing you, O wonderful king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing, to sell my wife and her people to be annihilated? And I imagine Haman's across the table like drumstick, half to his mouth. Like. Esther points across the table. An adversary and an enemy, this vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. He's been caught out. His scheme has been upturned. He hadn't realized that the queen was Jewish. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining, probably groveling at her clothes, begging for his life. The king exclaimed, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? And it goes on. As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So guards come in, cover his face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, that means the guys who served the king, said, a pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, that's handy, impale him on it. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. And then Esther and the king plan on how to overturn this edict that has been sent out for the Jewish people to be destroyed. And they overturn it. Now, I told you it was like a bit like a Shakespeare play, isn't it? It's like this massive irony that you get at the beginning. Whoever wrote this story, we don't know precisely who recorded it. They didn't just write it to keep history going. They wrote it to tell us something. And we can see that because of this way that they sort of play with the irony of the pole being erected and then Haman being impaled on it in the end, even though he'd intended it for Mordecai. They're trying to teach us a lesson. And I wonder if it's something to do with this idea that we have these two characters, Esther and Haman, and both of them understand that the future hangs in the balance. Haman understands that his actions are building the kind of future he's going to inherit. He's trying to set himself up, set up his status, set up his future so he can be the greatest in the kingdom. Esther understands that the future hangs in the balance. She understands that her people are at risk, that there may be this horrific act that there would be no coming back from. And they both do something about it. They both do something about the future that they think hangs in the balance. But there's a huge difference, both in terms of their ambitions, their desires, and the outcome. And I think the story wants us to pay attention to this, whoever wrote this story. Haman desires a future for himself. He's planning how he's going to rise through the ranks, how he's going to make sure that no one stands against him. He desires a future for himself, and he depends on himself for that future. He schemes, he plots, he uses his wealth, he uses his influence in order to get himself this future he desires. And he is impaled on his own ambition. He desires a future for himself. He depends on himself to get it. And he is impaled on his own ambition. It's like a warning from this story. But here's the thing, this is an incredibly common impulse, isn't it? To desire a future for yourself and to depend on yourself to get it. In fact, culturally, isn't that quite accepted and celebrated, that you should think about the future that you want and then you should do what it takes to get it, that you should go after it? Isn't this what we teach younger people? Like, think about, what do you want in the future? Go after it, get it, work for it, achieve it, compete with others in order to attain it. This is culturally quite normal for us. But the story gives us stark warning when Haman is impaled on his own ambition. By contrast, Esther desires a future for others. In fact, she risks her own future for others. She understands that there may be a great cost to her speaking up, that she may be put to death. But she desires a future for her people. She depends on God. She fasts, she prays. She knows that she hasn't got much to do with the outcome. She doesn't have the authority. She doesn't have the status. She depends on God. She trusts that there is something bigger going on, somebody who can act, somebody who has a hand in the future where she cannot. And she triumphs. The story celebrates her success, that this is the way to be courageous. And actually, I think these two characters, they teach us something about what courage actually is, what courage actually looks like. You see, you can't be courageous unless you have something or somebody to be courageous for, something bigger than yourself to act for. If you only have yourself, if you're only being courageous for yourself, doing things for yourself, that's not courage, that's assertiveness. Because there's not much risk to you in just doing things for yourself. It's assertiveness. Now, we might have all sorts of discussions about whether assertiveness is a positive thing or a negative thing, but it's not courage. It's not the same thing as the courage that Esther displays. And the other thing that it teaches us about what courage looks like is that you can't act against the odds without believing that there's something bigger that might have a hand in the future, without trusting in something bigger than yourself for the outcome. It doesn't make sense to risk your life if you believe that only you have a hand in what goes on in the future. You need to rely on some bigger sense of that there might be something bigger at work, that there might be a greater force going on. You know, depending on what sort of a faith you have, you might believe that is God, that God is working in the world to bring about his will. You might believe in other things, like people talk about the universe working in a certain way, or the ideals of justice and love always winning the day. It's very hard for us to act against the odds and put ourselves at risk unless we believe that there is actually something bigger going on that might influence the outcome. Esther desires a future for others. She depends on God. She desires a future for others. She has something bigger to be courageous for. She depends on God. She trusts that there is something bigger that might affect the outcome. And she triumphs. The story celebrates her and says, that is a courageous woman. Now, the only problem with that story, and if I ended the message here, the only problem that we might face is that that's not always the outcome. That people who do courageous things don't always triumph. That sometimes they just, as Esther may well have, they're just killed. They just suffer. They just are silenced. They just go unnoticed. And we might struggle with that this idea that this doesn't guarantee a positive outcome, that actually sometimes people desire a future for others, depend on God, and they face a worse outcome, that they suffer for being courageous. And the kind of good news in that is that at the center of the Christian faith is a courageous person who suffered and faced a bad outcome, who did these things that Esther did, but died, was killed, was put to death. Actually, that was what happened to Jesus. That's what we believe about what happened to Jesus. there's this point in Jesus' life where he has been ministering to people and he's amounted a huge following, and for that reason he has got enemies, people who want to silence him, people who want to put him to death, just as Haman wanted to get rid of the Jewish people. And Jesus knows that he's about to be tried, and he's about to be arrested and tried and executed. He knows that his execution date has been set. And he goes to a garden with a group of his friends in his final moments to do as the Jewish people did, to pray, to depend on God, to rely on God, knowing that there's an outcome coming his way. And Jesus is in this garden, and he's praying to God, and he says this prayer to God: "My Father, if it is possible, take this cup of suffering away from me." He knows that he is going to a cross to be crucified, the most brutal form of execution at the time. If it's possible, he says, I know that you have a hand in outcomes that I can't have right now. I know that I can depend on you. I know that this is ultimately in your hands, that it lies with you. If it's possible, take this cup of suffering away from me. He goes to his Father. He depends on his Father. Yet, he says, not my will, not my life, but your will be done. Not my life, not my future, but your will be done. As in, I want the future for others that you have in mind for the world. Jesus gave his life for the sake of the world, as according to the will of God, and he desired a future for the people that God desires a future for, which is the world, which is others. It's the same cost that Esther weighed up in her mind. If I perish, I perish, not my will, but your will. As in, I'm willing to put myself on the line for the sake of securing a future for others. Because of Esther's courageous act, because she acted for the future of the Jewish people, it paved the way for Jesus. If Esther hadn't have acted, if the Jewish people had been exterminated, Jesus wouldn't have been born. That Jesus was born into a Jewish family. Esther's actions, as we look back at them in history, paved the way for the birth of Jesus because of her courage, because she laid down her life, or she would have done if the king had executed her, for the future of others. And the future that Jesus desired for us, and his courage to do something about it, paved the way for you and for me. That's the reason that we are here today, because he depended on God, because he acted for the future of others, not for his own future. And I think this gives us a recipe for what it means to be courageous, especially when the future hangs in the balance, when our future hangs in the balance, when we might risk something or face a cost. That we can be courageous when we act for the future of others, not for the future of ourselves. And when we depend on God for the outcome. When we act for the future of others and depend on God for the outcome. Let me circle back to the question that we began with. That when the future is hanging in the balance, when we feel daunted by that, when there's a decision or an action we feel we should take, and we are frightened or afraid to do it, how do we find the courage to act? Well, I think it's in these two questions that this story prompts me to ask, and should prompt all of us to ask. Who do you desire a future for? Who do you desire a future for? Is it just for yourself? Are you just looking to secure your position, rise through the ranks, make sure you are okay? Make sure you and your family are set? Or do you desire a future for somebody else, someone else, more? Who or what will you depend on for the outcome? Are you going to rely on yourself, in which case there's going to be a limited number of things you're going to be willing to do because there's only so many outcomes you have the ability to control? Or are you going to trust in somebody who might have a hand in the future beyond your future? Who do you desire a future for? If you are a follower of Jesus, if you have opted to go Jesus' way, and by the way, I think these questions are brilliant, whether you have faith or whether you don't. The story begs for us to ask them. But if you have decided to follow Jesus, there are answers to these questions that we should have. Who do you desire a future for? Jesus said, desire a future for your neighbor, for the people who your life affects, who are affected by your decisions and your actions. That's who I want you to desire a future for. Not for yourself, but for others, just as he did for us. And who or what will you depend on for the outcome? Well, Jesus says, depend on God, depend on my heavenly Father, depend on his work in the world, the one who actually has a hand in the future beyond what you can control. Just imagine as we come into land what a difference it would make to our lives if when the future hangs in the balance, when we have a decision to make, when there's an action we feel we should take, moment by moment or in the big things of life, just imagine what difference it would make if we asked these questions when we felt daunted by what the outcome might be for us. Well, who do I actually desire a future for? Is it somebody bigger than myself? Is it someone beyond myself? And who or what will I depend on for the outcome? Am I going to depend on myself, or am I going to depend on God? Knowing whatever happens, he has a hand in the future, and he has his hand on me. Just imagine for a moment, what would it be like if we taught the next generation, the young people who are waiting for their A-level results in this building today? What would it look like if we taught them to ask these questions, to value these questions? Who do you desire a future for? You know that you can be part of something bigger than yourself, that you can desire a future for people beyond yourself, and you can depend on something beyond yourself. You can depend on God for the outcome, that no matter what results you get, what things you achieve, it doesn't take away from this, that you can desire a future for others, and you can depend on God for the outcome. Do you think that would relieve any pressure on them if they weren't just trying to desire a future for themselves and get an outcome for themselves, as Haman did? What would it change in our work lives if we asked these questions? Who do I desire a future for? Is it just for me in this organization, or is it for my colleagues? Is it for the people we work to benefit? And who or what will I depend on for the outcome of my actions? Would it help us to be more courageous at work? Would it help us to be more courageous in the decisions that we make about our work, whether to stay in a job, leave a job, pick up a job? Would it help us as we share our faith, if we have a faith? Well, who do I desire a future for? I desire a future for that person. I desire for that person to know in their future that Jesus is for them and he loves them and he's with them. And I'll depend on God for the outcome of that conversation. What would it change if we asked these questions more regularly? Just imagine if the story that we could tell of our lives was like the story Esther could tell of hers. Maybe not on such a big scale, but a story that says, I depended on God. I trusted him for the outcome. I did something for the sake of somebody else's future. Somebody else had a future because of something that I did. Maybe like Esther, like Jesus, somebody's story could hinge on something that you courageously did for their sake and for the sake of their future. It doesn't all depend on you. But when they tell their story, it could hinge on something that you did. We can be courageous, and you can be courageous, and I can be courageous when we act for the future of others. Trust the outcome to God. And all the way through this series, we've been talking about best case and worst case scenarios. Do you know that this is kind of the best case scenario that Jesus has in mind for your life? This is what he wants for you. This is what he wants you to do. Sorry, I know that that's something I must be doing, but I don't know what I'm doing. So, I'm electric. No. So, Jesus, I'm throwing myself off, right. So, this is the best case scenario Jesus has in mind for your life, that you would act for the future of others, and that you would depend on God for the outcome, no matter what that outcome is, no matter whether the next chapter of your life contains a best case scenario or a worst case scenario. There's nothing that can stop you from acting for the future of others, depending on God for the outcome, and he will write an incredible story through us as we do that, as we take the courage to do that. Let me pray for us, and then the band are going to come back up. Father God, I want to say thank you so much for this amazing story of Esther that we're able to still hear about. And I just pray that today that story would inspire us to have the courage to act for the future of others and to depend on you for the outcome. And for any of us who are wondering what we think about you, what we believe about you, I pray that our questions that have been raised from today, we would hang on to them. We wouldn't just leave them at the door, but we would continue to think about who is this God who might have a hand in the future? Who is this Jesus who invites me to act for the future of others and who acted for my future, who did something for my future? Father God, I just pray you would make us courageous people, people who do for others and impact others. And I pray that we would be able to depend on you in any and every circumstance that comes. In Jesus' name, amen.